Georgia, 1854. Inside a plantation house heavy with heat, a white curtain drapes over the bed and stirs faintly in the still air. The master sleeps soundly, his breath steady, like the ticking of a hidden clock. Beyond the door, a flickering oil lamp throws long, broken shadows across the floor. Henry Fields, clothed in rags, stands motionless, more statue than man. That night, meant for dreams, turned instead into a courtroom without drums, without soldiers, where silence delivered its own verdict. Henry was not born beneath chandeliers, but beneath a roof of warped planks where smoke clung to the walls and silence was taught before speech. His first lullabies were whispers, careful not to wake the overseer who prowled the night. From infancy, he learned survival as a lesson of silence, ears open, mouth closed. His mother was the first teacher. She had no books, no slate, no chalk, only hands, eyes, and instinct. She taught him to read the skies, to sense when rain was coming, to study the earth for roots even in barren ground, and most importantly, to read a man's eyes for the storm before it struck. These were not lessons of choice, but of necessity, carved into her by lashes and loss. She passed them on to Henry as a fragile inheritance. Every evening the plantation glowed in two colors. On the hill, the master's house burned bright with lamps and polished wood, its windows reflecting gold. In the quarters, only the orange. Haze of cooking fires lit the night, carrying the smell of beans, smoke, and tired breath. The two worlds stood only paces apart, yet a canyon deeper than any river lay between them. Henry's earliest memories were of staring at that glowing house, wondering how light could sit so close yet never touch. In the quarters, children invented games with stones and sticks, their laughter quickly swallowed when footsteps approached. In the big house, children played with dolls brought from Europe, their laughter unhindered, unpunished. Henry understood the difference not through words, but through rhythm. One laughter was heavy, checked, always braced for interruption. The other flowed freely, careless and unafraid. He grew tall for his age, shoulders already bent from hauling wood and water. To the master, Henry was only another body, another pair of hands. To the other children in rags, he became something else, a silent observer. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words cut through noise like a blade. He had inherited his mother's eyes, eyes that read storms, and though he was still a boy, people whispered that he saw too much. As the years folded in on themselves, Henry's world remained one of shadows, always watching, never stepping too close to the light. But shadows have memory. Shadows grow long when the sun sets. And Henry, the child of shadows, was already learning that every silence carried within it the seed of judgment. Every man who breaks does not break in the same way. For Henry Fields, it was not one whip, not one insult, but a series of small deaths that ignited the fire. He had once loved a girl from the quarters. Her name is lost to history, carried only in the faint traces of a song passed among the women. She was taken in a single afternoon, traded like a coin across a table. Henry was not allowed to hold her, not even to watch her leave. She vanished as quickly as smoke in the wind, and he was left standing in silence, fists clenched so tight that his nails drew blood. That was the first loss. The second was his father, a man who worked until his body crumbled under the Georgia sun, his back scarred into maps of cruelty. One day he collapsed in the field, never to rise again. They buried him not in the white cemetery, but in a ditch beyond the trees. No stone, no marker, just dirt pressed flat, as if he had never been. Henry's grief was not allowed to exist. Grief itself was considered rebellion. Each moment of loss etched lines into him, invisible tally marks of injustice. He carried them like an unseen book of debts, written not with ink, but with memory and scar tissue. And with each entry, the weight grew heavier, the silence louder. The master, his master, was a man who spoke often of mercy. He read the Bible each morning, words dripping with piety, but by afternoon he would sell, divide, whip, destroy. His mouth said grace, but his hands wrote torment. Henry knew then that mercy was only another chain, a false promise meant to keep the enslaved bowed. Hope became a myth, like spring after an endless winter. Henry learned that waiting for kindness was like waiting for rain in a desert sky, a prayer answered only with silence. And so the fire lit, not the fire of rage alone, but the fire of clarity. He saw the truth. Survival was no longer enough. To live as shadow was to vanish. To act, even once, was to exist. That fire, born of loss and sharpened by grief, would one day lead him into the master's room. For now it smoldered quietly, invisible to all but Henry himself. Preparation does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like routine. Henry Fields did not sharpen his hands on weapons. He honed them on chores. Every bucket of water carried, every log split, every nail hammered into wood was rehearsal. His muscles learned the rhythm of precision, his mind the patience of repetition. He understood that to move too fast was to reveal intent, but to move too slow was to invite suspicion. In the master's house, he studied without appearing to study. He knew the creak of the stair at the third step, the sigh of the door hinge when opened, the exact spot where moonlight slipped through the curtain. He watched how the oil lamp dimmed near midnight, how the master's breath shifted from restless to steady after his evening glass of whiskey. These were not idle observations. They were a silent clock, counting down. The quarters had taught him to wait. Nights by the fire, Henry would keep his hands still while others spoke in whispers, as if silence itself were training him. His eyes drifted to the great oak tree beyond the fields, the same tree that had watched over him as a boy. Its branches stretched outward like arms, waiting to hold something heavy. Each night it seemed to lean closer, as though it knew what was coming. Henry carried no book, no pen, but in his mind he etched a plan as carefully as if carved in stone. He practiced not the act itself, but the stillness that must follow it, the calm that must mask the storm. To falter in silence would mean discovery. To hesitate would mean death. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. To anyone watching, Henry was simply another figure in rags, carrying out orders, fading into the background. But beneath that disguise, he was building a ritual. The oil lamp became his metronome, the floorboards his scripture, the shadows his confidants. Preparation is not always a weapon sharpened. Sometimes it is silence honed until it can cut. The man Henry served was not merely cruel, he was contradiction made flesh. Each morning he stood tall in his parlor, Bible in hand, his voice spilling verses of mercy, forgiveness, salvation. His words filled the house with a theater of righteousness. Yet outside those polished doors, his actions erased every syllable. His whip tore through skin as easily as pen across paper. He divided families as others might shuffle cards, without pause, without thought. To the community, he was a man of standing. To the enslaved, he was a wound that never closed. His smile could precede a sale. His prayer could follow a beating. In him, Henry saw the perfect hypocrisy, a man who cloaked chains in the language of grace. Every scar on Henry's back was a sentence authored by that man. Each line of torn flesh was a scripture of cruelty. The pain had faded, but the memory remained carved as deep as any brand. When Henry bent in the fields, he carried more than baskets of cotton. He carried those scars, each one whispering of debts unpaid. The master slept each night like any other man. His head sank into pillows, his breath slowed, his body softened into dreams. But Henry knew. When the eyes closed, it was not innocence that slept. It was the system itself, lying unguarded. Sleep. The master was stripped of ceremony, stripped of power. In sleep, he was simply a man. Yet that man held the weight of every lash, every sail, every grave without a stone. To Henry, the master was not only flesh but emblem, the face of a structure that ground lives into dust. Killing him would not unmake the system, but it would unmask the lie that men who preached grace while dealing in chains could rest forever without judgment. And so, in Henry's mind, the master became more than an enemy. He became glass already cracked, waiting for the final shatter. The night did not thunder. It whispered. Cicadas hummed outside. their song folding into the heavy air of Georgia's summer. The plantation house, wrapped in white curtains, lay still. Inside, the master's room glowed faintly from an oil lamp, its flame trembling as if it sensed what was coming. Henry Fields moved like a shadow unpinned from its body, bare feet pressed against floorboards, each step memorized from months of study. The third plank near the bed groaned faintly, just as he had expected, but the sound was swallowed by the drone of insects outside. The curtain swayed as he entered, brushing his shoulder like a hand reluctant to let him pass. The master lay stretched, upon polished wood and linen, his breath deep, steady, unaware. In that moment, he was no overseer, no sermonizing patriarch, only a hypocrite suspended in the fragile innocence of sleep. Henry stood above him, and the silence thickened. The room seemed to hold its breath. The lamp's glow pulled long shadows across the walls, painting the chamber as if it were a cathedral of judgment. The first blow was not sound, but absence of sound. It split the night, not with noise, but with an emptiness so heavy it pressed against the walls. That silence was more violent than any cry. It was the silence of history's balance tilting, of scales groaning under the weight of a single act. In that instant, Henry was no longer only a slave, no longer only a son, a lover, a mourner. He was executioner, cloaked not in robes of law, but in rags of labor. The bed became gallows, the curtain a shroud, the oil lamp a witness. When he stepped back, breath quick and shallow, he knew there was no return. Shadows had crossed into light. Silence had become verdict. The house remained still. Yet everything had changed. The master's fall was not the end. It was the opening of a ledger Henry had carried inside his mind for years. There were others, men whose hands had not signed deeds but had wielded whips. A driver who dragged Henry's father through mud until his chest collapsed. A foreman who traded children like livestock. A trader whose gold teeth shone while families wept. None of them slept within reach of mercy. Henry had no parchment, no ink, no courtroom, but he had a list written in scars, memorized in grief and carried in silence. Each act would follow a rhythm. A door creaked. Footsteps quickened. Firelight trembled. Then silence, always silence. Henry did not roar. He did not cry out. He let absence speak louder than words. Each man fell into the hush. Henry's axe did not remain hidden long. Whispers of his ritual moved through the quarters like wind through grass, spreading faster than chains could contain. To the enslaved, his name became a song, sung in hushed tones. To the masters, it became thunder on the horizon, an omen they could not ignore. The patrols found him before dawn. Surrounded, there was no oak to shelter him, no curtain to mask him, no silence to cloak his steps. Iron shackles clamped around his wrists, biting like fangs. His journey from the shadows into the center of judgment had come. The trial was swift. It was not a trial in truth, but a ritual, an imitation of justice meant to restore the illusion of order. The courthouse smelled of ink and sweat, its benches crowded with townsfolk whispering. The charges were read as if carved already in stone. There was no defense, no plea, only the inevitability of a single verdict: death by hanging. The words dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples through the room, though no one doubted the outcome. On the morning of his execution, Henry stood before the gallows. His rags clung to him, torn and worn, yet they looked like vestments, the robes of a priest delivering his last sermon. The crowd gathered, murmuring, waiting for spectacle, but Henry gave them nothing. He did not weep. He did not beg. He did not curse. His silence was his final rebellion. If he spoke at all, it was only one phrase, carried so faintly on the wind that some swore they had imagined it. Even silence remembers. The trapdoor fell. Henry's body dropped, but his silence lingered, stretched across the square like a shadow that could not be erased. The town returned to its routines. The courthouse locked its doors. The masters tightened their grip, yet in the quarters, when fires burned low and songs drifted softly through the night, Henry's silence lived on, not his absence, but his presence. His death ended his body, but his silence became a language no rope could strangle. Henry Fields was gone. Yet in the silence he left behind, the enslaved found a strange and dangerous inheritance: memory. Henry Fields was not written into history as a hero. He was branded a criminal, condemned, forgotten in the official lines of ink. But in the shadows where memory breathes, he remained. To the masters, he was terror. To the enslaved, he was comfort. To history, he was a question. What is justice when law is injustice itself? Crowns may glitter, whips may crack, but even in rags, even in silence, justice can rise. They passed his name as though it were contraband. Men and women, after a day's labor, lowered their heads and recalled his silence, his defiance, his final words. It became more than a phrase. It became a mantra, a reminder that chains could bind flesh but not memory, that the act of speaking, or refusing to speak, could itself be resistance. The masters lived restless. Some swore they heard footsteps in the fields at night, as if Henry still walked the rows of cotton. Others claimed the old oak groaned heavier in storms, as though carrying his weight again. Whether superstition or guilt, the result was the same. Henry's absence had become a presence. Every attempt to bury him made him rise in whispers. Every erasure gave him permanence. His death created not a void, but a haunting, and so the consequences of his act spread, not in proclamations or ink, but in sleepless nights, in murmured songs, in the quiet fire of eyes that refused to dim. In the slave quarters, voices carried softer, but their words held iron. Around fires, mothers sang lullabies where Henry's name slipped between the notes. Children whispered it as they played games with stones and sticks, passing it as though it were contraband. The masters had hanged a man. But what remained was more dangerous. They had not silenced Henry Fields. They had given him to memory,